I'm leaving you. The moment those words left Olivia's lips, something inside my chest stopped, not shattered, not exploded, just stopped, like a clock that decided time wasn't worth measuring anymore, and I sat there staring at her across that polished dinner table in Los Angeles, trying to understand how the woman who once held my hand like I was her entire world could now look at me like I was nothing more than a phase she had already outgrown, and I forced a breath out of my lungs and leaned forward. Slightly, my voice quieter than I expected. Say that again, because part of me believed I misheard her, that maybe the music or the noise around us twisted her words into something cruel, but she didn't hesitate, didn't soften, didn't even blink. I'm leaving you, she repeated, calm, steady, like she had practiced it, like she had already lived this moment in her head 100 times before sitting here with me, and my fingers tightened under the table as I searched her face for any crack. Any sign this wasn't real. Why? I asked, the word barely making it out, and she exhaled slowly, almost like she was tired of explaining something obvious. Because I can't keep living like this. And I frowned, confused. Living like what? And she glanced at the man sitting beside her, and that's when I followed her eyes and saw him clearly, Marcus Reed, sitting there like he owned the air we were breathing, his posture relaxed, his expression almost amused, his hand resting casually over hers, and my stomach dropped so hard. It felt like I might actually fall out of my chair. You've got to be kidding me, I muttered, shaking my head slowly. Tell me this is some kind of joke? But Olivia didn't laugh, didn't pull her hand away, didn't even look ashamed. It's not a joke, she replied, and Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying me like I was some interesting problem he didn't need to solve. People change, he added, his voice smooth, controlled, and I turned to him sharply. Stay out of this. And he just smiled faintly, like my anger was expected, like it didn't matter, and I looked back at Olivia, my chest tightening more with every second. You're with him? And she nodded once, simple, final, and that small movement felt heavier than anything she could have said. Since when? I asked, my voice cracking despite my effort to keep it steady, and she hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. That doesn't matter, she answered, and I laughed under my breath, a hollow sound that didn't belong to me. It matters to me. And she leaned back slightly, her eyes softening just a little. Jason, you're a good man. And I cut her off immediately. Don't do that, because I already knew what was coming. And she pressed her lips together before continuing. But you're not enough for the life I want. And there it was again, those words that felt like they were being carved into me. Not enough, and I shook my head slowly, trying to process it. We had plans, I reminded her. We were building something, and she sighed like she had heard it before. You were building slowly. And I leaned forward, my voice sharper now. And that's a problem? And she met my eyes fully this time. It is for me. And Marcus adjusted his cuff slightly, speaking again without even looking at me. Ambition without results is just delay. And I clenched my jaw, ignoring him as much as I could. So you leave me for someone with money? I asked, and Olivia shook her head. I'm leaving because I want stability. And I let out another bitter laugh. Call it whatever you want. And silence stretched between us for a moment before Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, placing it neatly on the table in front of me, and I stared at it, confused. What is that? And he answered calmly, something to make this easier, and I didn't touch it. Nothing about this is easy, and Olivia looked at the folder briefly before looking back at me. Just open it, and I hesitated before finally picking it up, flipping it open, my eyes scanning the pages until the words started making sense. Ownership, property, location, and I frowned. An island? And Marcus nodded slightly. It's yours? And I blinked, trying to process it. You're giving me an island? And he leaned back, completely relaxed. Consider it compensation. And my grip tightened on the papers. Compensation for what? And Olivia spoke softly. For everything. And I looked at her, disbelief flooding through me. You think this fixes it? And she shook her head. It gives you a chance. And I slammed the folder shut, the sound louder than I expected. I didn't need a chance, I needed you. And that hit her. I saw it in the way her expression shifted for a split second. But it didn't change anything, nothing changed. And Marcus glanced at his watch like this moment had already gone on too long. And that was it, that was the moment. Something inside me went quiet, not broken, not angry, just done, and I pushed my chair back slowly and stood up, looking down at her one last time. You know what hurts? I asked, my voice steady now, and she looked up at me, waiting. It's not that you chose him, I continued. It's that you made me feel like I was never enough to begin with. And she opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but no words came out, and I picked up the folder, not because I wanted it, but because leaving it felt like losing again, and I turned away, hearing her voice behind me, Jason. And I stopped for half a second, just enough to hear her say, take care of yourself. And I let out a quiet breath. You too. before walking out of the restaurant, each step heavier than the last, the noise fading behind me as the cold night air hit my face, and I stood there for a moment, staring at nothing, holding the folder in my hand. An island, she left me and gave me an island, and I let out a low laugh that didn't feel real. Not enough, I whispered to myself, the words echoing in my head again and again, and my grip tightened slowly as something deep inside me shifted, something quiet, something dangerous. I'll show you, I murmured under my breath, not to her, not to him, but to myself as I stepped forward into the night, knowing that the man who walked into that restaurant was gone, and whatever I was becoming wasn't going to beg anyone to stay again. The boat engine cut off, and for a moment all I could hear was the ocean, endless and calm like it didn't care about anything that just happened to me, and I stepped onto the island slowly, my shoes sinking slightly into the sand as I looked around, expecting something, anything, but there was nothing, just empty land stretching out, no buildings, no people, no sign that this place even mattered, and I let out a quiet breath. So this is it, I muttered to myself, holding the folder tighter in my hand, and the driver behind me spoke casually, yeah, this is your island, like he was talking about a parking spot, not a life, and I turned slightly, there's nothing here, and he shrugged, that's what you got, before stepping back into the boat, and just like that I was alone, completely alone, standing in the middle of something that felt more like a joke than a gift, and I walked forward slowly, scanning the land, dry patches, uneven ground, a few scattered trees, the sound of waves crashing softly in the distance, and I laughed under my breath. An island, I said again, shaking my head. She left me, and gave me this, and the words echoed in my head as I kept walking, each step heavier than the last, until I finally stopped and looked out at the ocean, my chest tightening again as her voice replayed, you're not enough, and I clenched my jaw. Yeah. I heard you, I whispered, and my phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the silence, and I pulled it out, seeing Daniel's name on the screen, and I answered, yeah, and his voice came through immediately, you made it? And I looked around again, if this counts as making it, and he paused for a second, how bad is it? And I let out a dry laugh, there's nothing here, Daniel, nothing, and he exhaled, then sell it. Like it was the simplest thing in the world, and I frowned slightly. Sell it? And he continued, yeah, take whatever money you can get and move on, don't let this drag you down, and I looked at the ground for a moment, his words making sense but not feeling right. And then what? I asked, and he replied quickly, start over somewhere else, forget about her, forget about all of this, and I stayed quiet for a few seconds, staring at the empty land in front of me. I don't think I can do that, and he sounded confused, why not? And I tightened my grip on the phone, because if I walk away from this, then she's right, and there was a pause. Jason, this isn't about pride. And I shook my head even though he couldn't see me. It is, I said firmly. She looked at me like I was nothing, like I wasn't worth anything, and he sighed, that doesn't mean you have to prove anything, and I took a deep breath. I do, but not to her, and he went quiet again, waiting. To myself, I added, my voice steadier now, and I could almost hear him thinking on the other end before he spoke again, you're really going to stay there? And I looked around once more, the emptiness not feeling as suffocating as it did a few minutes ago. Yeah, I answered, and he sounded uncertain. And do what exactly? And I glanced at the land, the open space, the untouched ground. I don't know yet, I admitted, but I'm not leaving, and he let out a breath. This could take years, and I nodded slightly. Then it takes years, and he laughed softly, not mocking, just surprised. You're serious? And I replied without hesitation, I've never been more serious. And the wind picked up slightly, brushing against my face as I stood there, feeling something shift inside me, something small but solid, and Daniel spoke again, all right, if you're doing this then do it right, and I felt a slight smile form, I will, and he added, and you're not alone even if it feels like it, and I looked out at the horizon, I know, before ending the call, and the silence returned, but this time it didn't feel empty, it felt waiting, like the island itself was watching me, expecting something, and I walked further in, my steps more steady now. Nothing here, huh? I muttered, glancing around again, that just means I can build anything, and I stopped in the middle of the land, looking down at the ground beneath my feet. You're not enough. Her voice echoed again, and I closed my eyes for a second, letting it sink in one last time before opening them, sharper, clearer. We'll see about that, I said quietly, and I crouched down, grabbing a handful of dirt, letting it fall slowly through my fingers. This isn't nothing, I added, almost like I needed to hear it out loud. This is a start. And I stood up again, taking a deep breath as the ocean stretched out in front of me, endless and open, and for the first time since that night, my chest didn't feel like it was collapsing. It felt lighter, not healed, not even close, but different, like something inside me had finally stopped breaking and started building instead. and I looked ahead, my eyes narrowing slightly as a quiet determination settled in. "I'm not running," I said firmly, my voice carried away slightly by the wind. "I'm building," and I slipped the folder under my arm, taking another step forward, then another, each step more certain than the last, and the island didn't look like a joke anymore, it looked like a challenge, and I wasn't going to lose this one, not again, not ever. And as the waves continued to crash behind me, steady and relentless, I kept walking, already planning, already thinking, already becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone who didn't need anyone to tell him he was enough, because this time I was going to prove it, not with words, not with promises, but with everything I built from this empty piece of land. The first week broke me, not physically but mentally, and I remember standing in the middle of that empty island, staring at the ground like it owed me something. "So what now?" I muttered, kicking a small rock forward, and no answer came, just the sound of waves behind me, and I pulled my phone out, dialing Daniel, and the moment he picked up, he didn't even wait. "You still there?" And I let out a breath. "Yeah." And he paused. "Tell me you changed your mind?" And I shook my head even though he couldn't see me. "I didn't." And he sighed. "Jason, listen, this isn't a movie. You don't magically build an empire from dirt." And I looked around again, the emptiness still real, still heavy. "Then I'll learn how," I replied, and he went quiet for a second before speaking again. "With what money?" And that question hit harder than anything else because I didn't have an answer. "I'll figure it out," I said anyway, and he let out a short laugh, not mocking, just worried. "You're stubborn?" And I smirked slightly. "I have to be." And the call ended not long after, leaving me alone again, and the next few days turned into a blur of small failures. I tried sketching ideas, tried marking areas, tried planning something that didn't even exist yet, and every attempt felt incomplete, pointless, and one evening I sat down on the rough ground, running my hand through my hair. "This is stupid," I whispered, frustration building, and my phone buzzed again, this time my father's name on the screen, and I hesitated before answering. "Yeah." And his voice came through firm, direct. "I heard what you're doing." And I closed my eyes for a second. "Then you heard wrong." And he didn't react. "You're wasting your life," he stated plainly, and I clenched my jaw. "I'm building something," and he scoffed. "On what? Empty land?" And I looked around again, my frustration rising. "It won't stay empty," and he replied instantly. "You don't have the resources, the experience, or the connections." And I leaned forward slightly, my voice tightening. "Then I'll get them." And he paused before speaking again, slower this time. "Or you'll fail." And those words sat heavy in the silence between us, and I swallowed hard. "Maybe," I admitted. "But I'm not walking away." And he exhaled, not angry, just disappointed. "You always do this." And I frowned. "Do what?" And he answered, "Chase things that don't make sense." And I shook my head. "This makes sense to me." And he didn't argue further, just said quietly, "Don't come back asking for help when it falls apart," before ending the call. And I sat there for a while after that, staring at the ground, letting his words sink in, letting the doubt creep in again, and I whispered to myself, "Maybe he's right." But something inside me pushed back immediately. Something stubborn, something that refused to accept that ending, and I stood up slowly, brushing the dirt off my hands. "No," I said firmly, "not this time." And the next few days I pushed harder. I started researching, calling random contacts, asking questions I barely understood, and most of the responses weren't encouraging. "It's too risky," one voice told me over the phone. "No infrastructure," another added, and I nodded each time even though they couldn't see me. "I understand," I kept saying, until one call changed everything. "You're trying to turn raw land into a development?" a calm female voice asked, and I straightened slightly. "Yes." And she paused for a moment before continuing, "That's not impossible." And I blinked, surprised. "It's not?" And she let out a small breath. "It's difficult but not impossible." And I felt something shift inside me again. "What would it take?" I asked, and she replied clearly, "A legal angle." And I frowned. "Explain." And she continued, "If you can classify the island as a private development zone, you can bypass certain restrictions." And I leaned forward, my interest growing. "And how do I do that?" And she answered, "You don't do it alone." And I let out a quiet breath. "Who are you?" And she replied simply, "Sophia Bennett." And I repeated her name softly, letting it settle. "Can you help me?" And she didn't hesitate. "I can guide you." And that was the first real step, the first time this didn't feel like a losing battle, and over the next few weeks, everything changed, not quickly, not easily, but steadily. Sophia walked me through legal structures, zoning strategies, and loopholes I didn't even know existed. "Focus on positioning," she told me during one call, "not size." And I nodded. "Got it?" And she added, "Investors don't care about what it is now, they care about what it can become." And those words stayed With me shaping every decision I made, and slowly things started moving. I secured initial approvals, built basic proposals, reached out again, and this time the responses were different. "Send me more details," one investor said, and I felt a small smile form. "I will," and another added, "There might be potential here," and I leaned back slightly, letting that sink in. Potential, and I thought back to that night, to Olivia's words, "You're not enough," and I shook my head slightly. "We'll see about that," I muttered, and for the first time, it didn't feel like I was proving something to her. It felt like I was building something for myself, something bigger, something real, and as I stood on that same empty land again, looking out at the horizon, it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a beginning, and I whispered quietly, "This is just the first brick," knowing that everything ahead would be harder, but also knowing that I wasn't the same man who walked onto this island anymore. I was someone who stayed, someone who fought, someone who built, and this time I wasn't stopping. Months passed, and one morning I stood on the same island that once looked like nothing, watching workers move across the land, machines cutting through dirt, structures rising slowly, and I let out a quiet breath. "This is actually happening," I murmured, and Daniel's voice came through my phone. "Told you, once it starts, it doesn't stop," and I smirked slightly. "You didn't tell me it would feel like this," and he chuckled. "Like what?" And I looked ahead, my eyes tracking the progress. "Like I'm finally catching up," and he paused. "Catching up to who?" And I shook my head. "To the version of myself I should have been," and he didn't respond immediately, just let that sit before saying, "You're doing more than catching up," and I lowered the phone slightly, watching as a small structure was being set up near the shoreline. "It still doesn't feel real," and he replied, "It will when the money starts coming in," and I let out a quiet laugh. "That part I'll believe when I see." And just as I ended the call, another one came through, an unknown number, and I answered cautiously, "Hello?" And a deep, composed voice responded, "Jason Carter," and I straightened slightly. "Yes," and the voice continued, "This is Victor Kane," and I froze for a second, recognizing the name immediately, and I stepped aside, lowering my voice. "I know who you are," and he let out a small breath. "Good, that saves time," and I felt my grip tighten on the phone. "What can I do for you?" And he didn't hesitate. "I've been reviewing your project," and I glanced around again, almost instinctively, and he replied calmly, "It's interesting," and I raised an eyebrow slightly. "Interesting enough to call me?" And he let out a faint chuckle. "Interesting enough to invest?" And those words hit differently, not like a shock, but like confirmation, like everything I had been building finally being seen, and I leaned against a temporary railing. "What exactly are you offering?" And he responded, "Funding, connections, scale," and I nodded slowly. "And what do you want in return?" And he answered simply, "A percentage," and I smirked slightly. "Of course," and he added, "and control over certain decisions," and I looked out at the island again, my mind already calculating. "I built this from nothing," I said quietly. "I'm not handing it over," and he paused. "I'm not asking you to," and I waited. "I'm offering to make it bigger," and I exhaled slowly, weighing the words, and after a few seconds I replied, "Send me the terms," and he didn't push further. "You'll have them today," before ending the call, and I lowered the phone, staring ahead again, my reflection faintly visible in a glass panel nearby. And for a moment I barely recognized the man looking back, and I muttered softly, "You're not invisible anymore," and that realization settled deep, changing something inside me. And over the next few weeks, everything accelerated, meetings, calls, negotiations, and I found myself sitting across from people who would have never even noticed me before. "Your proposal is solid," one investor told me, and I nodded. "It's only the beginning," and another leaned forward. "You're moving fast," and I met his eyes. "I don't have time to move slow." And every conversation felt like a step forward, not rushed, not desperate, just controlled, steady. And one evening, I sat in a temporary office built on the island, reviewing documents when Daniel walked in. "Look at you," he said with a grin, and I glanced up. "What?" And he gestured around. "Office, investors, plans. This doesn't look like the same guy who called me from an empty island," and I leaned back slightly. "It's not," and he raised an eyebrow. "No?" And I shook my head. "That guy was waiting for things to happen." And he crossed his arms. "And this guy?" And I met his gaze directly. "Makes them happen," and he smiled. "I like this version better," and I chuckled quietly. "So do I." And as the days passed, my name started appearing more often, mentions in business circles, small features, quiet recognition, and one afternoon Sophia called me. "You've caught attention." And I smirked slightly. "Good or bad?" And she replied, "Both," and I leaned forward. "Explain," and she continued, "Good because people are noticing your growth, bad because competitors are starting to look closer." And I nodded slowly. "Let them." And she paused. "You're confident?" and I replied calmly, I'm prepared, and she let out a small breath, just don't underestimate them, and I smiled faintly, I won't, and after the call ended I sat there for a moment letting everything settle before my phone buzzed again with a message from Daniel, and I opened it, a simple line, you saw the news? And I frowned slightly replying, what news? And he sent a link and I opened it, my eyes scanning quickly Marcus Reed's company, internal issues, financial pressure, leadership tension, and I leaned back slowly, a quiet realization forming. So it begins, I whispered, and I didn't feel excitement, not exactly, just a calm awareness that things were shifting, that the balance was changing. And later that night I stood outside looking over the island as lights illuminated parts of it that used to be dark, and I spoke softly to myself, you walked away thinking you won, and I let out a slow breath, but you didn't see this coming, and for the first time I wasn't thinking about proving anything, I wasn't chasing her, I wasn't chasing anyone, I was building something bigger, something that didn't need validation. And as the wind moved gently across the island, I felt it clearly, not anger, not pain, but control, and I straightened slightly, my eyes steady, my voice calm, I'm not the same man anymore, and that wasn't a promise, it was a fact, and whatever came next, I wasn't going to face it as the man who lost everything, I was going to face it as the man who built something from nothing, and that difference changed everything. The invitation arrived in the middle of a normal afternoon, and I remember staring at the envelope longer than I should have, my name printed cleanly across the front like it belonged there, like I had always been part of that world, and I let out a quiet breath. So it finally reached me, I murmured before opening it, my fingers steady but my chest tightening slightly as I pulled out the card, and there it was, bold and simple, an invitation to a high-profile corporate event in New York, hosted by Marcus Reed, and I leaned back slowly in my chair, staring at those words like they were more than just ink, like they carried something deeper, something unfinished, and I whispered, you noticed me, not with anger, not with pride, just with a quiet understanding, and my phone buzzed, Daniel's name lighting up the screen, and I answered without hesitation, you saw it? And he didn't even greet me, tell me you're not going, and I smirked slightly, you already know the answer. And he let out a frustrated breath, Jason, this isn't just an event, this is a setup. And I stood up slowly, walking toward the window, looking out at the island that no longer felt small, everything is a setup, I replied calmly, and he paused, he's inviting you into his space, and I nodded slightly, exactly, and he continued, that's not something you walk into lightly, and I turned my gaze forward, my expression steady, I'm not walking in lightly, and he stayed quiet for a moment, before asking, then why go? And I took a breath, because I'm not the same man who walked out of that restaurant, and he didn't argue, just said quietly, I know, and after a short silence he added, just be careful, and I nodded even though he couldn't see me, I will, before ending the call, and almost immediately another call came through, Sophia, and I answered, you saw it too, and I could hear the slight smile in her voice, of course I did, and I leaned against the desk. Thoughts? And she didn't hesitate, it's time, and I raised an eyebrow slightly, that simple? And she replied, you've been building quietly, now you step into the light, and I let her words settle for a moment, and Marcus? And she answered calmly, he's acknowledging you, and I nodded slowly, which means he's watching, and she added, which means you've already won half the battle, and I smirked faintly, I haven't won anything yet, and she responded, you will, and I exhaled. Slowly, feeling that familiar calm settle in, then I'll be there, and she paused before saying, make sure when you walk in you don't carry the past with you, and I understood exactly what she meant, I won't, and after the call ended I stood there for a while, staring at my reflection in the glass, and I barely recognized the man looking back, not because he looked different, but because he felt different, stronger, quieter, controlled, and I whispered to myself, you're not going back. There as him, and that realization stayed with me as the days passed, and when the night finally came I stood outside the venue in New York, the city lights reflecting off the glass building in front of me, people moving in and out, voices blending into a constant hum, and I adjusted my suit slightly, taking a slow breath. This is it, I muttered, and as I stepped inside, everything felt familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. The polished floors, the soft lighting, the quiet conversations. The kind of place where decisions were made without raising voices, and I walked forward steadily, my eyes scanning the room, not searching, just observing, and I could feel it, the subtle shift in attention as people noticed me, some recognizing, some curious, and I kept moving, calm, controlled, until I heard it, a voice I hadn't heard in months, Jason. And I stopped, not immediately turning, letting the moment stretch for just a second before I faced her, Olivia, and for a brief moment, Neither of us spoke, her eyes scanning my face like she was trying to find something familiar, something she once knew, and I gave a small nod. Olivia, and she took a step closer, her expression softer than I remembered. You look different, and I allowed a faint smile. I am, and she hesitated like she didn't know what to say next. I've been following your work, and I raised an eyebrow slightly. Have you? And she nodded. It's impressive, and I met her gaze calmly. Thank you. And there was a pause, not awkward, just filled with things neither of us needed to say, and she looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. I didn't expect you to, and she trailed off, and I finished it for her. Become this? And she nodded slowly, and I shrugged lightly. Neither did I, and for a moment I saw it, something shifting in her eyes, something that wasn't there before, and before she could say anything else, another voice cut in, Jason Carter, and I turned. Slightly, Marcus standing there, the same composed expression, the same controlled presence, but this time I didn't feel anything when I looked at him, no anger, no tension, just clarity, and I nodded slightly. Marcus, and he stepped closer, studying me with quiet interest. You've done well, and I met his gaze evenly. I've done what I needed to do, and he let out a small breath, almost like approval. Impressive. And I replied calmly, thank you, and there was a brief silence before he added, I'm glad you came. And I held his gaze. So am I, and in that moment I realized something simple but powerful. I wasn't standing there as the man who lost everything, I was standing there as the man who built something from nothing, and as the conversation around us continued, as the night moved forward, I felt it clearly, not as a thought, not as a realization, but as a quiet truth. I belonged here now, not because someone invited me, but because I earned my place, and as I stood there, calm and steady, I knew this was only the beginning. The shift didn't happen loudly. It started quietly, almost unnoticed, and I remember sitting in my office on the island when Daniel walked in without knocking, his expression sharper than usual. You've seen it? He asked, and I looked up from the documents in my hand. Seen what? And he tossed his phone onto the desk. Marcus Reed's company, and I picked it up, scrolling through the headlines, financial instability, internal disputes, investors questioning leadership, and I leaned back, slowly exhaling under my breath. So it begins? And Daniel crossed his arms, watching me closely. You don't look surprised. And I shook my head. I'm not. And he frowned slightly. You had something to do with this? And I met his gaze calmly. No. And he raised an eyebrow. Not even a little? And I let out a quiet breath. I didn't need to. And he stayed silent for a second before nodding slowly. So you just watched. And I corrected him softly. I built. And that difference mattered more than anything, and my phone buzzed on the desk, Sophia's name appearing, and I answered immediately. You've seen the reports, she said without greeting, and I replied, I have, and she continued, it's worse than it looks, and I leaned forward slightly. Explain, and she spoke calmly. Debt pressure, poor decisions, overconfidence, it's catching up, and I nodded. And the investors? And she answered, they're nervous, and I smirked faintly. Good, and she paused before adding, be careful. And I tilted my head slightly. Why? And she replied, when someone starts falling they get unpredictable, and I understood exactly what she meant. I'm not stepping in, I said clearly, and she responded, I know, but you're still part of the board now, whether you want to be or not. And I let out a slow breath. I'll handle it. And after the call ended I stood up, walking toward the window, looking out over the island, the same place that once felt like nothing, now alive with movement, growth, purpose, and I whispered quietly, you did this. Not as a reminder but as a fact. And later that evening I found myself back in the city, attending another meeting, and as I stepped inside, I felt the familiar shift in atmosphere, the quiet tension, the subtle glances, and I heard my name more than once, not whispered, not ignored, but spoken with recognition. And as I moved through the room, I saw her again, Olivia, standing near the edge of the space, her posture slightly different, her expression less certain, and she noticed me almost immediately, her eyes locking onto mine, and for a brief moment, everything around us faded, not because of emotion but because of clarity, and she walked toward me slowly. Jason? Her voice softer than before, and I nodded once. Olivia? And she stopped in front of me, hesitating slightly. Can we talk? And I looked at her, really looked, not searching for the past, not expecting anything, just seeing her as she was, and I replied calmly, we are? And she let out a small breath. I mean, privately, and I shook my head slightly. There's nothing private left. And that hit her. I could see it in the way her expression shifted. Things aren't what I thought they would be, she admitted quietly, and I raised an eyebrow slightly. They rarely are. And she glanced down for a moment before looking back up. Marcus, he's not. And she struggled to finish the sentence, and I completed it for her. Untouchable? And she nodded slowly and I let out a quiet breath. No one is, and she studied my face like she was trying to understand something she couldn't reach anymore. You're different, she said, and I replied simply, I am, and she took a small step closer. Do you ever think about before? And I held her gaze steady, unaffected. No, and that answer landed harder than anything else I could have said, and she blinked slightly, caught off guard. Not at all, and I shook my head. That version of me doesn't exist anymore, and she swallowed, her voice quieter now. I didn't mean to, and I stopped her gently. It doesn't matter, and she looked at me searching for something, maybe anger, maybe regret, but I felt nothing, not even the need to respond, just calm, just distance, and after a few seconds she nodded slowly, stepping back. I understand, and I inclined my head slightly. Take care of yourself. And as she turned away, I didn't watch her leave, I didn't need to, because whatever connection we had once held was already gone, and I shifted my attention back to the room, to the conversations, to the opportunities, and later that night, I received another call. Daniel again. You talked to her? He asked, and I replied calmly. She talked to me, and he paused, and I leaned back slightly, looking out at the city lights. Nothing, and he sounded surprised. Nothing? And I repeated, nothing, and there was a silence before he let out a small laugh. That's new, and I smiled faintly. That's growth, and he added, and Marcus? And I looked ahead, my expression steady. He's already losing, and Daniel's voice dropped slightly. You're not going to push? And I shook my head even though he couldn't see me. No, and he asked quietly, why not? And I answered simply, because I don't need to, and that truth settled deep, stronger than anything I had felt before. And as I stood there, calm and steady, I realized something important. I wasn't waiting for his fall, I wasn't chasing revenge, I was just moving forward, building, growing, and letting everything else unfold on its own, and somehow, that felt more powerful than anything else I could have done. The day Olivia arrived, the island looked nothing like the place she once handed me like a joke, and I stood near the edge of the resort, watching the waves move steadily as a car approached from the main path, and Daniel's voice came through my phone. You sure about this? And I replied calmly, I didn't invite her, and he sighed, still doesn't mean you have to see her, and I looked ahead, my expression steady, I will, and he paused before saying quietly, just don't go back, and I let out a slow breath, I'm not going anywhere, before ending the call, and as the car stopped, the door opened and Olivia stepped out, and for a brief moment I saw it clearly, the hesitation, the uncertainty, the difference, and she looked around at the island, her eyes taking in the buildings, the lights, the life that now filled the space, and then she saw me and everything else seemed to fade for her, and she walked toward me slowly. Jason. Her voice softer than I remembered, and I nodded. Once, Olivia, and there was a pause, a long one, where neither of us rushed to fill the silence, and she looked at me carefully like she was trying to understand something she couldn't quite reach. This place? She said quietly, glancing around. You built all of this? And I answered simply, yes, and she let out a small breath, almost like disbelief. It's beautiful, and I didn't respond to that, just stood there waiting, and she shifted slightly, her hands coming together in front of her. I didn't expect this, and I tilted my head slightly. What did you expect? And she hesitated. I don't know, not this, and I nodded once. Most people didn't, and she looked at me again, her eyes softer now. I was wrong, and I stayed silent, letting her continue, and she took a step closer, her voice quieter. About you? And I held her gaze, calm, unaffected, and she swallowed slightly. I thought you wouldn't make it, and I replied evenly, you weren't the only one, and she shook her head quickly. No, it was more than that, and her voice broke slightly. I didn't believe in you, and I watched her, noticing the tears forming in her eyes, but feeling nothing from it, no pull, no pain, just distance, and she continued, I thought I was making the right choice, and I responded calmly, you made a choice, and she nodded slowly, and it was the wrong one, and I didn't correct her, didn't comfort her, just let her say it, and she wiped at her eyes, trying to steady herself. I'm sorry, she said finally, the words hanging in the air between us, and I looked at her, not searching for sincerity, not testing her, just hearing it, and after a moment I replied, I know, and she blinked slightly, surprised. That's it? And I nodded, that's it, and she looked at me, confusion mixing with the regret in her expression. You're not angry? And I shook my head, no. And she took a step closer, her voice almost desperate now. Why not? And I answered simply, because there's nothing left to be angry about. And that hit her harder than anything else. I could see it in the way her shoulders dropped slightly, in the way her eyes searched mine for something that wasn't there anymore, and she whispered, do you hate me? And I met her gaze steadily. No, and she swallowed. Then what do you feel? And I paused for a moment, not because I didn't know, but because I wanted the answer to be clear. Nothing, I said finally, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything we had said before, and she stepped back slightly, like she needed space to process it. Nothing? She repeated, and I nodded once. That version of me is gone. And she looked around again at the island, at everything I had built, and her voice came out softer, almost broken. I didn't lose you when I left, did I? And I didn't answer right away, letting the truth settle between us before speaking. No. And she closed her eyes briefly, like she already knew what I was going to say next. You lost me when you decided I wasn't enough. And that was it. That was the moment it fully sank in for her, and she let out a shaky breath, her eyes filling again. I was wrong, she whispered, and I nodded slightly. Yes. And there was no cruelty in my voice, no satisfaction, just truth. And she stood there for a few seconds, not knowing what to do next, not knowing what to say, and finally she nodded slowly, wiping her tears. I understand. And I inclined my head slightly. Take care of yourself. And she looked at me one last time, searching, hoping maybe for something to change, but nothing did, and after a moment she turned and walked away, her steps slower than before, her posture heavier, and I watched her go, not because I needed to, but because it felt like the final page of something that had already ended long ago. And when she disappeared from view, I let out a quiet breath, not of relief, not of sadness, just calm, and I turned back toward the island, toward the life I had built, and I said quietly to myself, it's over, not as a question, not as a hope, but as a fact, and as the waves continued their steady rhythm behind me, I walked forward, not looking back, not wondering what could have been, because whatever that was, it didn't matter anymore, and for the first time, it truly felt like I had nothing left to prove to anyone but myself. The news broke early in the morning, and I remember standing on the balcony overlooking the island as my phone buzzed repeatedly, messages flooding in, headlines confirming what had already been building for weeks. Marcus Reed's company had finally collapsed, and I stared at the screen for a moment before locking it, letting out a slow breath. So it's over? I murmured quietly, and behind me Daniel's voice cut in, completely, and I turned slightly, seeing him walk toward me with a look that was part disbelief and part satisfaction. Investors pulled out overnight, he continued. Ryan Steele didn't hold back, and I nodded once. He never does. And Daniel leaned against the railing, glancing out at the island. You didn't even touch him. And I gave a small shrug. I didn't need to, and he let out a short laugh. That's the part one still can't get over. And I looked ahead, my expression calm. Some people destroy themselves faster than anyone else could. And he studied me for a moment. You don't sound happy. And I shook my head slightly. I'm not. And he frowned. After everything? And I met his gaze briefly. This was never about him. And that seemed to settle something in him, because he nodded slowly. Yeah. I see that now. And after a moment he pushed off the railing. You built something real. And I replied simply, I did. And he smiled faintly. And you didn't lose yourself doing it. And I didn't answer that right away because I knew how close I had come, but instead I just said, I learned. And he gave a small nod before stepping away. I'll leave you to it. And as he walked off, I turned back toward the ocean, the steady sound of waves filling the silence, and for the first time in a long time, there was nothing pulling at me, no unfinished business, no lingering anger, just calm. And later that day, I walked through the resort, watching people move through the space, hearing quiet conversations, seeing life in a place that once held nothing but emptiness. And as I reached the garden area, I noticed someone standing near the edge, and when I got closer, she turned slightly, meeting my gaze with a soft, steady expression. Jason? She asked gently, and I nodded. Yeah, and she smiled lightly. I'm Emily. And I recognized the name. Sophia had mentioned her before, someone who had recently joined one of the development teams, and I offered a small nod. Nice to meet you. And she glanced around the island, her expression calm. This place, it feels different. And I tilted my head slightly. Different how? And she thought for a moment before answering, peaceful. And I let that word settle, because it wasn't something I had ever associated with this place before. And I asked quietly, you think so? And she nodded. It doesn't feel like it was built out of anger. And I gave a faint smile. It wasn't. And she looked at me more carefully. Then what was it built from? And I paused, considering the question before answering. Pain, at first. And she didn't look away. And now? And I met her gaze steadily. Choice? And she smiled softly, like she understood more than I expected. And we stood there for a moment, not rushing to fill the silence, and she spoke again. You don't seem like someone who holds on to the past. And I shook my head slightly. I used to. And she asked quietly, what changed? And I let out a slow breath, looking out at the horizon. I realized it wasn't helping me move forward. And she nodded. That's harder than it sounds. and I gave a small shrug. It took time, and she smiled again. It always does, and there was something about her presence, something calm and steady that didn't demand anything from me, didn't pull me back into anything I had already left behind. And after a moment she glanced at me. Are you staying here? And I nodded, yeah, and she tilted her head slightly. Good, and I raised an eyebrow. Why? And she replied simply, because this place suits you. And I let out a quiet breath, feeling something settle in a way I hadn't expected. And as the sun began to lower, casting warm light across the island, I realized something important. I wasn't standing here as the man who had been left behind. I wasn't defined by what I lost, I was defined by what I built. And as Emily walked beside me talking about small things, about the work, about the future, I listened, not distracted, not distant, just present. And later that evening, as I stood alone again near the edge of the island, I looked out at the water, the horizon stretching endlessly in front of me, and I whispered quietly, you were always enough. Not as a reminder, not as a correction, but as a truth I finally understood. And I closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting the sound of the waves settle everything inside me. And when I opened them again, I wasn't looking back anymore, I was looking forward, and for the first time that felt like more than enough.